Turner, why did he come here when he seemed to be, you know, quite a wealthy man? And you sort of think, why?
Well, I've got a theory about that. I don't know whether anyone saw it. It was a long time ago. It was Who Do You Think You Are? And it was the actress Jane Turner. And I contributed to that, and we talked about that with her. And it's only my view, based on you know, what I've researched. And I'm pretty sure that it was exactly that thing, that if he could be landed in a way that he couldn't possibly have aspired to in Britain, he could become a gentleman, and his children could become ladies and the one thing he didn't have was that status, and in Britain he couldn't buy it. He was trade, he was a commoner. And actually at the very end of that Who Do You Think You Are, the last document I held up for Jane Turner was one of the obituaries of James Woodward Turner, and it describes him, and it says, James Woodward Turner, gentleman. So things changed, he made it. It was a tearful moment. I love a tearful moment. Yes, that's my view. I think he could give his family here the one thing he could. I mean, his youngest son, James, I talked a lot about the schooling of the others. James Turner went to one of the most expensive private schools in England, out in the countryside. He could buy that for his son. He couldn't make him a gentleman. I've lulled you to sleep with the sing-song.
Was there any connection between those three major families that you mention as settlers out here in England before they came?
No, I don't think so. There were some connections. I think there was one, a deliberate non-connection, and I think that was probably to do with between John Molloy and Turner. John Molloy's family, that he tried to keep very quiet about, would never talk about the past, because his father was very much like Turner. His father was very successful boot and shoe business, and it was virtually around the corner from where James Woodward Turner had his business. So I think Molloy would have been tried very hard not to let that connection come through. There were certainly connections afterwards. James Woodward Turner had a very successful brother in Bishopsgate in London who was, I mean, we could call him a biscuit maker. He was quite an important, wealthy man. He was consulted when the government wanted to do something to do with the weight of loaves. They consulted him to advise them. And quite a few of the settlers' families back in Britain liaised with this Mr. Turner in London, and he would send a lot of stuff out. They would. There's a very interesting letter from Mrs. Bussell a couple of years later, if you're interested in the Turner family, where she says that Mr. Turner's brother, the biscuit maker, she's very delighted that he has confirmed the news of Alfred's engagement to Nancy Turner. Well, I didn't know about that, and that's in a letter in the Batty Library. It must have fallen through fairly quickly, because within a couple of months she was married to MacDermott. But there was a brief period when Alfred Bussell was engaged to Nancy Turner. That's an aside. So no major connections between. But Georgiana Molloy did say that her mother had mentioned Mrs. Bussell. She wrote in a letter to her mother, I think this is the Miss Yates of Jamaican extraction that you have mentioned to me. And yes, Mrs. Bussell was of Jamaican extraction.
We hear a lot about Georgiana Molloy and a lot of the other females, but never anything, or hardly anything of Mrs. Turner.
Yes, yes. That's a very interesting comment. What we do hear about her sometimes from her stepchildren, who didn't seem to like her. They seem to think she was cold and cruel, but I know that's, I mean, I'm a stepmother myself, and I know that, as I say, people are often unreliable narrators. One of the things I did find, which I don't know whether it's generally known, I don't think so, was that actually James Woodward Turner didn't marry Maria Rockley, who was his second wife, his wife's sister, until a few weeks before they got on board the Warrior, when his youngest son James was about 2.5 years old. And I'm sure they would have wanted to keep that quiet. They wouldn't have wanted the neighbours to know that they hadn't been married during the first few years of their bringing up their own family together. I suspect she may have been a very quiet, private person. I don't know. We don't hear very much about her. But now you've made me want to find out more about her. It's all your fault. Good question.
Jan.
Could I ask a question about Georgiana and the fact that her mother was a very rich woman, but there wasn't a lot between them, even though they didn't get on. And her ideas about a lady and what she was doing with the flowers and the plants and how important they were to her, was it in part because of the religious and the fact that a lady did these sorts of things?
I think Georgiana was a bit of a different kettle of fish. I think she was not a rebel, but I think she was very modern in her openness and her viewpoints. But I think what you say is also very true. She was definitely raised very much to be a lady, and I think she, there are people who described her saying she was the most ladylike woman in the colony. But I think somehow with Georgiana it's more to do with, you know how some people just have an innate quality of being a lady, and it's not to do with how posh they talk or what they put on the table. There's something very ladylike about them, and I think that comes more from a quality that you have within you. It's partly to do with the fact that she was really quite a pious Christian, not as much as people have said in the past, but I think she was very, I think she cared about people, and I think she was very open. For example, we know that she stopped one of the sailors on the voyage and engaged in a long conversation with a black sailor. So to talk to a sailor, for someone who was concerned about being a lady, it wouldn't have happened. And to talk to a black sailor, definitely wouldn't have happened. So I think she was much more different. I think it's one of the reasons I was drawn to her to do all that research in the first place. I think she had qualities of being open to new ways of thinking about things.
You've shown us a series of documentary gems. How many hours of research behind each of those?
I couldn't even begin. I mean, I probably spent altogether about 3 days of work putting the presentation together, but that was largely to do with finding all the things that you might like that we knew, and then whittling them down, and then talking with Mike about where we might zoom in on something where you needed to see the words, or and I do spend even though I'm not writing a book about Georgiana anymore, I spend hours every week. I mean, I'll go home tonight and try and find out more about Mrs. Turner. No, thousands and thousands. But I love it, otherwise nobody makes me do it. I certainly don't get paid to do it, so I'm an amateur. I love what I do, so.
One last question there.
Sure. How much to the romanticism that you outlined earlier do you think the Napoleonic Wars contributed?
Oh, very much. It was all part of that. Life was a mess in Britain after the Napoleonic Wars. The men who did come home were wounded in many different ways. The price of bread was still high. They thought it was going to solve everything, but people were still starving. There weren't jobs for wounded soldiers. Families were torn apart by men who didn't come back, and by what happened when men did come back. And there was I'm very into romanticism. It was something I studied a lot as a young person, and I happened to love the writing of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Georgiana's mother knew the Coleridges. There's a whole connection there with the lake poets in the part of the world that Georgiana lived. So I'm very interested in it. But I think of Romanticism as a sort of national yearning for the past. That's how I think of it. You know, and of course it wasn't a wonderful past. The past was just as bad as the present. But it was it was a combination of a yearning for the peaceful, bucolic, rural life. A simple life. But it was also the idea of that sublime thrill of going, like that man on the mountaintop, into the unknown. We're British. We're going to conquer the land. And it's one of the reasons why gardens, in contrast with the sort of 18th century gardens that were so ordered, you know, if you think of the Tuileries or you know, any of those very ordered gardens, the new gardens looked wild and random and sort of tumbling plants. But actually, it was all just as carefully planned. It was carefully planned random planting. Even in Georgiana's case, she loved this kind of cottagey English garden, and she talked about things winding around the windows and creating a beautiful view. But she also describes how carefully John Molloy and Staples, the gardener, measured everything out. So it was like, we want it to be random, and we have such a simple... If you're interested in Romanticism, read about Romanticism, read about Burke and the idea of the sublime, the picturesque and the beautiful, and then read some of the letters that John Garrett Bussell and Charles Bussell wrote, and it's there. It's there in the language that they used. It's that carefully balanced combination of we have this wonderful, beautiful, simple life, but we're also civilised and gentlemen, and we're conquering the unknown lands of southwest of Western Australia.
Can I sneak one more in?
Sorry?
Can I sneak one more in first?
If it's brief.
And I'll do a very short answer, I promise.
I think this is an answer of yes or no.
I don't do those. I don't do those.
Well, thanks for putting us on notice. Now, when those settlers arrived at Fremantle in 1829, I think it was, they were expecting allocations of land on the Canning River and Swan River areas. Would you agree with the fact that Captain Stirling, being an excellent naval officer, had allocated all that land around the banks of those rivers to his fellow naval officers?
Yes. You knew I was...
Well done.
You set me up for that one.